Good afternoon, everybody. Or for those of you who are sadly to the west of me and still enjoying your morning, hopefully that is all still good. You're all hopefully here for the Installing and Configuring SharePoint 2013 on a Test Environment without screwing it up too badly webinar. I'm Todd Klindt. For the next hour or so-ish, we're going to go over installing SharePoint 2013 on a test environment. And as those of you who have installed SharePoint before know, you can't install SharePoint in an hour. So we're gonna skip some parts. We're gonna talk some parts. I've got some parts set up ahead of time. Machine, the VM's on an SSD. It's the only thing on the SSD. All that kind of stuff. But we're still going to be pushing it to go for an hour. But we will do what we can. Here is my vanity slide. I imagine most of you know who I am already, but for those of you that don't, here I am. I'm Todd Klindt. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I have been for 7 cycles now, which puts me in MVP since 2006. I know that 2006 plus 7 not equal 2012, but it all works out. As an MVP, that just means that I've got a big mouth, essentially, not commentary on my skills so much as my lack of ability to be quiet. And the way that I make my noise, I do public speaking. I'll be speaking at SharePoint Saturday, New Hampshire, for instance, here in a few weeks. And also do some writing. Have written 5 books on SharePoint. Got another one that we're going to be starting here on SharePoint 2013 pretty quick. So I do that. And all the things that you're going to hear me talk about today are things that I learned as a consultant. These are all real-world things as we talk about stuff that I'm doing. That's where it came from. So it's all real-world stuff. I blog a lot of my stuff at toddklindt.com/blog, so feel free to run right out there. It's hosted on Rackspace, so it can take the traffic. Go ahead and make that happen. The company website, I work for Rackspace, but I used to work for SharePoint 911. Rackspace bought us a few months ago. We're kind of still transitioning things over. So go ahead and hit that if you want to see what's going on there, and that's got it's got our SharePoint stuff and all that. Also, if you want to email me, there's where you can email me, and I'm also watching the Twitter. So if you've got questions, I don't think I can see the questions in GoToWebinar right now. So if you're putting questions in there, I am ignoring them at the moment. But if you are on Twitter, you can send it. So it looks like, oh, now I can see questions. Okay, so somebody has commented on my skills in dressing myself, the hat. That's awesome. So yeah, that hat, that's Shane and I outside the Louvre in Paris 5 years ago. It was unseasonably cold and my little ears got chilly, so I bought a French hat, and that's how I look. Okay, so let's dig in to the webinar. Kind of got an agenda. We're going to do this a little crazy, a little backwards because of the nature of installing SharePoint. We're not going to be able to talk about things and do them in order because there's a couple of parts that take some time. So the first thing we're going to do is jump in and start the farm build. Then we're going to jump back out while that's finishing and kind of talk about building the foundation a little bit. I've done a bunch of the long stuff first. I've already got some things installed. We're going to talk about that, but we may end up doing things out of order just so that we try to get done in time. But we're going to talk about building the farm. We're going to talk about building the foundation for the test machine. And then we're talking, this is the non-SharePoint stuff. This is Windows and SQL and all that kind of stuff. After the farm's built, we're going to configure the farm and just talk about the different pieces, how things have changed and all that. My assumption is that you have built a SharePoint 2010 farm or two in your life and that you are familiar with that process. You're going to find most of the comments that I make are going to be in the context of deltas from SharePoint 2010. So if you haven't installed SharePoint 2010, just nod your head and act like you know what I'm talking about. That will make you less embarrassed in front of your friends. So the slides and all that will be up on that URL. They are not yet. I've been kind of tweaking the slides, so they're not up there yet, but they will be this afternoon. In the chat room, somebody's asked, what is this architecture? 2 machines, 3 machines, what? This is going to be for a single machine. and I'll explain why when we talk about our hardware requirements, but I will talk about the things that I would do different if it was on multiple machines. We'll talk about that a little bit. Mike in the chat room is asking, will recording be made available? I know that this is being recorded, so don't do anything embarrassing, because when I make fun of you, it will be recorded for the ages. There is a recording being made. I'm not sure how that's going to be distributed. I don't know how you're going to be able to get it, but if you want the recording and it's not obviously shown up and you've looked on Twitter or whatever and haven't found it, shoot me an email, todd.klindt@rackspace.com, or a tweet, and I'll chase it down for you and see what we can find. And maybe I'll put a shortcut to it in that page or something, I don't know. But yeah, it's being recorded, so I've been asked not to use swearing words. We have HR now. I can't cuss. It really cramps my style. It's weird. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create the farm. And this, again, we're kind of doing things out of order because this part could take a long time. I've had it go either way on me, so I'm not playing with fire this time. We're going to do it first and try to get past this part. At this stage of the game, we're going to assume that the foundation is laid, and we're going to talk about the foundation in a few more slides. What I have done, I've laid the foundation. I've installed Windows and SQL and did a bunch of tweaks there. The prerequisites are installed. So this is, you've fired up the splash screen. You've clicked the prerequisite installer. It all looks very similar to SharePoint 2010. If you've installed SharePoint 2010 at all, this will all be very, very comfortable for you. So I've installed the prerequisites. There are four prerequisites that don't get installed with the prerequisite installer, and they are Windows patches. And this is no different. SharePoint 2010 is the same way with the REST patch that you needed. So after you run the prerequisite installer, go to that blog post of mine and install the other three. There's a fourth one that I don't have linked there yet that I will do, but you're going to want to do those first. And again, they're Windows patches. I'm guessing at some point they're going to show up in Windows Update or Windows Service Pack or something. But Windows 2008 R2 needs those. Someone just posted a really long question in the chat room, and I will read that when I get a minute. The other thing that I have done is I've installed the bits. So I've installed the foundation, gotten that going, got the prerequisites installed, and now I've actually installed the bits but not configured them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use PowerShell to prevent a database being created with a GUID. I hate GUIDs. When I was in high school, GUIDs used to beat me up, steal my lunch money, and stuff me in a locker. So I've got a lifelong campaign against GUIDs, and this is one of the ways that I exercise that. So that's this step here. Again, it's out of order, but we might run into some time issues. So and if you've ever done any presenting, demo slides are a great way to bulk up your slide count without actually adding any value or doing any work. Okay, so what I've got is I've got a single machine here, and it's got, like I said, SharePoint installed and all that. Let's close this down for now. The instructions, the method that I use for creating SharePoint 2013 is not radically different than 2010. There's a few bits and pieces that are different, but if you've read my SharePoint 2010 install blog post, then you're going to notice a lot of this is very similar. So after I've installed SharePoint on a machine, two of the first things that I do is I pin Central Admin and I pin PowerShell to the top of my start menu. The reason for this is whenever I'm RDPing into a SharePoint box, it's usually for one of two things: to do something in Central Admin, though you could do that remotely, or to do something in PowerShell, which you could also do remotely. But normally that's when people jump into to the Windows or to the server. So I put those up here. The other thing that I do is for the management shell, in order for that to do most of the things that you needed to do for SharePoint, you need to be elevated. And so I come in here, and I apologize for GoToWebinar freaking out, but I go in here and I click the Advanced button and I click Run as Administrator, because you're going to need that for everything anyway. So I just go ahead and change that shortcut so that I don't forget sometime, get into PowerShell, and not have things work. So we'll go back out here. One of the two reasons, we're in here. All right. So normally, we expect this message, the farm is not accessible. Normally that would scare the bejesus out of us, but there's no farm to access yet, so this is understandable. This doesn't freak me out yet. And then the other thing is we've got a whole bunch of nasty grams here about PowerShell. That's just part of SharePoint 2013 right now. I guess another thing to keep in mind is that this is just a beta, so our recommendations are going to change, things are going to work differently. I'm going to do this session again in a month at SharePoint Saturday in New Hampshire. I'm guessing some of my guidance is going to be different just because we're learning the product, it's in flux, so things like this, these errors, you're just going to have to make peace with them. Another thing we've got here I do in PowerShell is I always enable quick edit. It gives me my right-click, copy and paste, all that. So another thing that I do every single time that I open up PowerShell ever in the world is I type my favorite commandlet start transcript. And what that does is that creates a text file with all the things that I type and all the things that PowerShell types back into a text file, puts it in my documents library right here. And so it's a good, CYA thing. If something burns down, you can go see what happened. But also as you're noodling around in PowerShell, it gives you a great diary of what you've done. So if you, find some crazy way to do something and then forget what you did, you can go back to that transcript and see. Other thing is I've got an E drive, and it's got all of my notes and stuff in it, all my scripts and all that. So I'm going to pull this out. And this is what I use. Now, when we configure the farm, we have to use PowerShell to do part of it. Let me do this because of this little bugger right here. That right there is the part, this is the whole reason that we do this in PowerShell is so that we can define the central admin content database name. If we don't, if we run the wizard, after the install, then it's going to create this database, but it's going to put a GUID at the end, and we don't want that. So when you're building your farm in 2013 or 2010, the important part is that you script this part. Now you can script the rest, which is all of this, and that's fine if you want to, or as long as you've done this part, you can run the wizard afterwards. So you can do this part, create the databases, and go from there. So I'm going to put them all out there just so we can get that part going, because this is one of the parts that will take a while. And again, I'm just to be clear, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I'm doing all this as the SharePoint install account. We're going to talk about accounts in a minute, but this is all happening as the install account. Okay, so I did not specify, though I could have, on that line my farm account and my farm passphrase and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to put that in now. And again, this is not the account that you're running as, this is the farm account. And when I put my scripts out there, I'll put it so that part's baked in. This is actually not the exact script that I used, or that I normally use. And that's going to be off to go. The other thing I normally do is fire up Task Manager, just like keep an eye on things, see how they're going. Okay, so let's let that run for a minute. I'm going to go back to our slides. I'm going to move that over to my other monitor so that I can keep an eye on it. Let's try something dishonest. Okay, so we are at the building ourselves a farm spot. That's going on the other monitor. I'll come back to that when that's ready. Okay, so hardware considerations. This is something that I wanted to bring up because this is something that we're all going to have to consider when we're installing SharePoint 2013. So the first question is, can I squeeze this all into one box? Somebody already asked that. We were 6 minutes in. Somebody asked if this would all go into one box. Yes, kind of. Again, keep in mind this is beta software. So Microsoft doesn't have any guidance on production systems because there is no such thing as a production system with beta software. But if you go to that link that I've got up there, it talks about how for test and development environments, which this is, the minimum requirement for RAM is 24 gig for a test environment, 24 gig. And so that's this. I mean, that's what we're doing, 24 gig. Now, I don't have any machines laying around with 24 gig free. I don't imagine you do either. So we just kind of got to make do, I guess. I've been able to make do with 10 gig on my VMs, barely. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tricks that we can do to make that bearable. But again, for test and production VMs, we're looking at 24 gig. And 4 cores, which is, you know, when you start virtualizing things, that gets all kind of fruity. But yeah, so somebody in the chat room there recognized that the minimum requirements for SharePoint 2013 are 3 times the minimum of 2010. It's absolutely right. The minimum requirements for SharePoint 2010 were 8 gig of RAM. And I can tell you, every time Microsoft comes out with a product, they publish minimum specs. So like the minimum specs for Windows 7 are something crazy like a gig of RAM. When we see that, when we see Windows 7 needs a gig of RAM, we all look at it, we point, and we laugh. We're like, a gig of RAM? Nobody would ever run that with the minimums. But for whatever reason, with SharePoint 2010, when people see that it needs 8 gig of RAM, they're like, boy, I wonder if I can squeeze that into 6 gig of RAM. So I don't know. I mean, so SharePoint 2013 does a whole bunch of crazy new things, and it caches a whole bunch of crazy new things. So it needs more memory just for the added stuff. But part of me also doesn't wonder if they boosted that up because they realize that people are trying to run it with less RAM than they say. I can tell you in all seriousness that the lowest I've seen on a production SharePoint 2010 server, had a customer call, hey, my SharePoint 2010 server's acting wonky, it's not loading well. A production SharePoint 2010 server had 2 gig of RAM, 2 gigabytes of RAM. It did not run very well at all. So take these minimums into consideration. So in the chat room, someone asks, does it really matter for performance if you use SSD or HDD? What do you recommend? So I will tell you for VMs, which is what this is, the context of this talk and what I do, running it on a solid-state drive absolutely makes a hell of a difference. And it actually helps you a little bit with not being able to give it as much RAM because it can swap faster, those kind of things. So absolutely running VMs on a solid-state device is the way to go. For production environments, you're not as much on the edge. Clearly, solid-state devices are going to be faster all the way around, but with a production environment, you're probably going to have more RAM so that things are cached better, so you're getting better performance that way. I'm not being able to benefit from that because I just don't have enough RAM to do it in this box. So solid-state drives if you can. The other thing was, do I recommend SharePoint 2013 with Windows 2008 or 2012? Right now, I'll put it on Windows 2008 R2 because of a couple reasons. Number one, Windows 2012 is also beta right now, and I can only wrestle one beta at a time. Also, I've heard some rumblings that SharePoint 2013 doesn't like a couple of things that AD in Windows 2012 does. So the fact that this is all one machine means that it would have to use 2012 AD, and I just heard there's some problems with that. So I have not gone that route yet, and I don't know if it will work or not. I know with I've heard rumors that some of the early betas would not install at all in 2012, so I just didn't even try it. So Callahan asked, she's not seeing the chat questions. That's actually something that I see as an organizer, so you can't see them, unfortunately. But they're saying very complimentary things about you, Callahan. They're very excited that you're here, and me too. So I get by with 10 gig barely. Now, there's a couple of things that I do to make that work a little better. So Mike is asking what version of SQL. Ask and ye shall receive, Mike. So here's that foundation that I was talking about, that foreshadowing that I did to get you all whipped into a lather about the foundation part. Here's kind of the cast of characters that I'm using. The first is Windows Server 2008 R2, 64-bit. And I kind of talked about why that was already. There's the AD things, the fact that I understand Windows 2008, and I can get to just battling the SharePoint beta as opposed to battling Windows beta and all that other kind of stuff. If you don't have a Windows license, you can download an evaluation version of Windows at that URL, and you can download them as a VHD or an ISO or whatever. I forget how long that runs, 90 days, 120 days, something like that. And with a couple of, with one pretty easy to run VB script, you can actually extend that. You can rearm your trials, so you can have that thing running for a while. But also if you've got MSDN or TechNet or something, you can get your Windows 2008 licenses that way. The next thing that I put on answers Mike's question, which version of SQL? I've got SQL 2012 64-bit. I've got another slide here about SQL, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. But again, if you don't have MSDN or TechNet or whatever, you can download a trial of it at that URL. And again, that runs for 60, 90 days, something like that. So that gets you your foundation. And then obviously you need SharePoint, and there is the link to SharePoint right there. So what do we do with these characters here? The first thing that I do is I tweak Windows a little bit. And so things like I put the desktop extensions on so that I can get Explorer View and stuff like that. I shut off the limited admin view in Internet Explorer. I forget what it's called. That's that server manager there. That's just a pain. That's so I shut that off. Just do some tweaks like that. Kind of get Windows. I shut off the shutdown tracker, that kind of stuff. And I've got some scripts for that, not for all of it. I'll put what I have out in that link when I actually get that all set up. Mike in the chat room is asking SQL Enterprise. You don't need SQL Enterprise. You can actually use SQL Express if you'd like to. SQL Express is free, but it's got some restrictions. It's got like a 10 gigabyte database limit, I think like a 1 or 2 gig memory limitation. It's got a processor limitation, but it's free, and it's enough for basic SharePoint 2013 stuff, content databases, service application databases, all that jazz. If you want to do full SQL, you can use Standard or Enterprise. I think I'm using Enterprise on this one just because I have an MSDN license and it all costs the same. It's all free. So I think I do Enterprise just so that I have everything there. In real life, and again, the context of this is a test environment, in real life you would need Enterprise for some of the higher-end business intelligence stuff. And we're talking like reporting services and Power View and all that. That's what's going to depend. That's what's going to determine your SQL version. But any version of SQL will work, and if you pick the wrong version, if you pick SQL Express and find out you need SQL Standard, you can upgrade them, or you can just move them, either one, so you're not locked in to one instance of SQL. So then after I get Windows installed and tweaked the way I want, then I run DC promo to create an Active Directory domain. If you do go with Windows 2012, this is all different in 2012. The other thing is, earlier somebody asked if I'm doing this all on one machine. So these directions are if everything is on one machine. If they were not on one machine, you wouldn't necessarily have to do this second step. You could have your domain controller on a second machine, or you could be leveraging an existing test domain. If you do that, a couple of words of caution. I would use a test domain. I would not do this in a production domain. Because as you do things like run the user profile service and stuff like that, you're going to be touching AD, and you don't want to be testing on production, so don't do that. The other thing is if you've already got a test domain out there and you want to leverage an existing one, you've got a SharePoint 2010 test domain out there, I would create new service accounts, regardless of the fact that they're, for the most part, the same, at least at this point. I would use new service accounts, and that way, again, you're not worried about somebody having access to something they're not supposed to or accidentally changing things. I've got a hysterical story about how I did that earlier in my career that, oh, gee, unfortunately we don't have time to go over, but you want to keep those accounts separate if you can. So I would create new accounts. All right, install's coming on. If you're going to leverage an existing machine. You could also, if you wanted to have extra, if you've got extra machines and you don't want to run this all on another machine, you could put SQL on another machine also. You wouldn't have to have everything on this one box. And with the exception of your domain control, these things are easy to shuffle after the fact. If you got everything running on one box and wanted to move SQL later, you could. It's not too tough to do. Okay, so fiddle with the domain and machine bits. The domain, a couple of things that I do is I set the domain password policy so that the passwords never expire. By default, the Windows, they expire in like 90 days or something like that. The test environment, that's not important. So I just shut that off because that will always be one of those things, one day I'll turn my VM on and I can't log in anymore. So I make those changes. When I create my service and user accounts, I use PowerShell and I use a CSV file for that, and I'm happy to share that with you. It's some incredibly poor PowerShell, nothing at all to emulate or nothing I'm proud of, but it does work pretty well. It creates the service accounts, creates the user accounts, and gets that all populated. Again, I don't know about you guys, but I do this all the time, build these VMs, so having these reusable bits scriptable is pretty handy. So I do that, I get that all ready in AD, and then I install SQL. And I got to do SQL second because I got to leverage some of those accounts. So when you install SQL, again, it can be any version, Enterprise, Standard, BI, or Express, Standard, BI, or Enterprise. Any of them will work. For what we're going to be doing today, you only need the database engine and the client tools, and I think probably more correctly the advanced client tools. If you're going to do some of the crazy BI stuff, you can install the SQL Server reporting services or Power View or all that stuff. You can do that now, or you can do it later, just rerun the SQL install. But to just get base SharePoint running, you just need the database engine and the client tools. Another thing that I always do when I'm creating these test environments is I add an administrative user. When you're walking through that SQL install, one of the places asks you to create a user, to add a user to that group. I always do that so I don't end up locking myself out of SQL, because that's happened more times than I'm proud to admit. I normally just use the domain administrator because I don't use the domain administrator for anything with SharePoint. So I just add that domain administrator, then if for whatever reason I can't ever get into SQL, then I can just use that account. If you don't do that, there is a way to open up to start the SQL Server service in single user mode, which gives domain admins or local admins access to it. It's a pain in the butt. You don't want to rely on that. It'll take you an hour to get that going and figured out and timed correctly. So don't go that route. Another thing that I do, which is very valuable for this, is I set a maximum memory value for SQL. So I guess more correctly, I adjust the maximum memory value. Out of the box with an install, SQL is set to take up no more than 2 terabytes of RAM. So go ahead, raise your hand if you've got a machine with more than 2 terabytes of RAM. Nobody? All right, me either. So what I do is I normally pare that down to be 1 or 2 gig less than the amount of system RAM. I do that for 2 reasons. Number one is I've had in the past, in the 15 years I've been doing this job, I've had SQL freak out and just take a machine down, just absolutely gobble up all the RAM and not give it back. And so logging into the machine and trying to shut it down or trying to fix the problem is problematic because there's no memory left. So I normally shave off a gig or so for Windows, just so that I know that SQL can never do that. The other thing is starting in SharePoint 2010 but carrying over to 2013, SharePoint uses a lot of RAM, and it knows that. It tries to cache as much as it can. It caches till it hurts. And so it will gobble up a lot of RAM, and it uses that cache. We need that cache. SharePoint 2013 has a new kind of cache, the distributed cache. So I want to give it a little bit of RAM for that. Now both SQL and SharePoint will take as much RAM as you will give them, whether they need it or not, and they will aggressively cache things and then give it up as the system starts getting squeezed. What I don't want is that to happen a lot. I don't want them to be giving things up a lot, so I always lock SQL down so that there's a little bit of breathing room for everything else. I think in my VM right now, my VM has 11 gig of RAM. I've got SQL set to max out at 10 gig. The next thing you have to do is SharePoint 2013 requires the max degree of parallelism setting in SQL to be 1. This is a setting inside of SQL that says if you have more than one core, and we all do these days, if a process comes in that can be split up, what's the maximum amount of threads I can kick off for that? And SharePoint, much like myself, is an only child. It doesn't like to share. It wants all of its stuff on the one CPU. And so you need to set that to 1. If you don't set that to 1, SharePoint will set it for you if it has permission. If not, it will just fail. And we'll talk in a minute where that part will fail. Actually, it's already done. So the part that will fail is when you create your configuration database. Remember, we did that as the install account. So the install account, either with the wizard or that set or the new SP config database commandlet, will create your config database and then try to set this max DOP, max degree of parallelism, setting to 1. Or we'll check it. If it's not 1, then the install account will try to set it to 1. And if the install account is not a sysadmin in SQL, which it should not be, that will fail. SharePoint will throw its hands up and spew red text on your screen if you're doing it in PowerShell, or the wizard will fail. So then you'll need to go back into SQL, and you'll need to set that max degree of parallelism to 1, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then go delete the config database, because for whatever reason it checks this after it creates the config database but before it populates it. And so you need to go in and clean that up. And SharePoint 2013 will absolutely not install or not configure if that's not set correctly. The next thing I do is I change the model database's settings. When a database is created in SQL, you have the option to define its recovery model, and that's how it handles transaction logs, when it purges them, things like that. If you don't define that when you create the database, then it looks at the model database and uses that database's settings. And so for test environments and for development environments, you probably don't need those transaction logs. So I set the model database to simple. And I probably should have put that in the slide instead of just say change it. But I set it to simple. That means your transactions are purged as soon as they're hardened to the database, which keeps your transaction logs small, which keeps your drives from getting full. A bunch of databases in SharePoint don't specify that, and some do, so this gives you the option of putting the ones that do to simple. And then finally, I add SP install to the DB creators and security roles. So let's go look at my VM, although you guys have been seeing it up to the side of the screen for quite a while now. So, all right, so the PowerShell ran all my lines here, and so we added the application content, we created central admin, we added the features, the services, all this kind of all the same stuff that we've done in SharePoint 2010. So we can close that. Now if we go here, we actually should get us some SharePoint. Now I don't know if this demo is going to work. Coming up. Another trick, I was talking to Michael Blumenthal. Him and I are doing a PowerShell session at SharePoint Fest in Chicago. So he gave me this idea, and I don't know if this is going to work or not. We'll see. Another thing you can add to the end of your PowerShell that creates your farm. Let's see if this works. Everybody quiet?
SharePoint farm configured.
So you can configure PowerShell to speak to you. So I just put that little text thing in there. A couple of questions from the chat room. Did you say to set all databases to simple or just a config database? For a test environment, I'm saying set them all to simple. For a test environment, you don't need to do point-in-time recoveries. You're probably not doing anything crazy like transaction log shipping. So for a test environment, they should all be simple. For a production environment, they should be full. You should have some sort of backup plan, disaster recovery plan, all that kind of stuff. That's something that, if you're the SQL admin, then you need to understand that. If you're not the SQL admin, you need to talk to them and understand that. Doug asks, is there a reason why the install account can't be sysadmin in SQL when setting up a test environment? I understand the least privileges rule for production, but is there some other reason? No, Doug, it's least privileges, but it's so I can tell you where this happened. So with SharePoint 2007, SharePoint 2007 didn't handle least privileges very well, and so I was lazy and young, and I needed the money, and I didn't know any better. So we really did everything as like 2 accounts, and they were all local admins, and everything worked, but it wasn't least privileges, and it just wasn't very secure. So with SharePoint 2010, I started taking this whole thing pretty seriously. For you specifically, Doug, I know you're a developer, though I like you anyway. For you, it's especially important that you use least privileges, because when you're developing code and you're trying things, there are many examples of things that don't work correctly because they were clearly developed by somebody who had non-least privileges. And that's not a ding on developers. I've got plenty of dings on developers. That's not one of them. So for you, it's really imperative that you develop things in a least privileges environment so that you know you're not accidentally using a permission that you didn't know you had. So So like that MaxDop one would be a perfect example. You know, somebody's installing SharePoint, they make their install account a sysadmin, and they don't realize that it's making that change in SQL, and then somebody else doesn't do it that way, everything breaks, they don't know why. But it's good practice. And for me as an admin, it's good practice to figure this stuff out on test environments, so when I do production environments for users, I'm doing a good job. So here's Central Admin. I wanted to show you a couple of things. Now this is something, and this is just you know, just the general Windows thing. I'm logged in as the install account. It has no permissions in SQL. But let's imagine that we discovered that MaxDop thing was not set correctly. So I want to open up SQL Management Studio and fix it, but I can't because I don't have permission. And I don't want to log out and log back in. So if you notice when I right-click on here, I got some options: run as administrator, blah, 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 blah. What I really want is run as a different user. So if you hold down Shift and then right-click, then you get this run as a different user. So since I know my administrator account is a local admin, or as a SQL admin, I can run it as that user, and now I'm doing least privileges. You know, my install account can't make any changes to SQL that I don't want it to, but I still don't have to log out and log in and go through a bunch of mess that way. So let's go through some of the settings that I talked about here. So memory, here's the maximum amount of memory. So by default, this is 2 terabytes. I set this to 10 gig or whatever, a couple of gig less than the system, to keep SQL from strangling. And then here is that max degree of parallelism right here. And let's just show off my super mad presenter skills. Zoom it. So there's that, and that is set to 1, and that was something. Now I did that with a script. Unfortunately, I'm not able to copy and paste into this VM. So all these changes that I made with a script that I will put in that little thing. So the other thing, here's that model database. We want to go to Properties. And Options, Recovery Model, Simple. And that's this one right here. And then server roles, I guess for logins, we've got the install account. Same stuff as 2010. DB creator, security admin. So we've all done that before. So that is there. But again, that the whole right-click run as a different user thing is incredibly handy when you're working on these one server systems. So another thing that I talked about was creating users. So let's look at this. We've got all of our service accounts. I had to create those before I could do any SharePoint stuff. I've got like a SQL account and all that. But I don't have any users in here. So let's do that. So one thing, very tangential, but SharePoint 2013 leverages PowerShell version 3. The PowerShell version 3 integrated scripting environment, pretty slick. So I'm going to go ahead and load that up. And I'm also going to run that as a different user because my install account can't create AD accounts. So I'm going to log in as this to load that up. In the chat room, Adam is asking, hey Todd, any idea why the MaxDop change has been made from SharePoint 2010 to 2013? So that's a good question. In 2010, SharePoint 2010 liked MaxDop being one, but didn't stick to it. Wasn't mad if you didn't do it. With 2013, it absolutely requires you to. I assume there's just new, new stored procedures and stuff out there, and it's just being more specific about it. I don't know specifically what ones are causing that though. So I have this, not on my CD drive. I have this incredibly inefficient and horribly written PowerShell here that will walk through and create Active Directory users for you. So it adds the Active Directory thing. It imports a file called users.csv from the local directory. And there's 2 chunks of code here. One of them is if the user doesn't have a manager, and one of them is if it does. Because service accounts and bosses won't have a manager. And so when you try to do that little bit right there, when manager is nothing, new AD user fails. So there's probably more eloquent, better ways to do this. I have not done that yet. The other thing, and I don't have this ready for public consumption, the other thing that I put at the end of this, actually would put it right here, is I look in the local directory to see if there's a .jpeg file that has the same name as the user. And then if there is, then I use some PowerShell to add their picture. So I'm going to run that. I have a users.csv file that is right here, and this is just coworkers of mine. So you might recognize some of those names, but this is just what I use for one of our internal VMs. So if I run this, it's going to save it first. All right. Come on, demo gods. There we go. See how easy that is? So let's try this. There we go. So it's created a bunch of users for me, and if I come in here and refresh, bloop, users. So that's a great way. Again, this is one of those things where if you're scripting a lot of things and doing these creations over and over, that's a great way to just have a bunch of users in SharePoint. Okay, so we've got SharePoint up here, but we don't have anything. It's not doing anything yet. Good question. Chris in the chat room asks, what service accounts am I using and what permissions do I give them? I'm using the same guide that I used for SharePoint 2010. And not that I can say for sure that none of it has changed, but for the most part, the things that I've done in 2013 lend themselves to the same accounts. I'm sure the more I use 2013, I'll probably add a couple more accounts in here. I've already got ideas about it. And then when RTM comes, then we'll have to reevaluate all that. But for the most part, for the thing that I'm doing, these accounts here in AD are the same accounts that are here on my blog post. And if you go to my blog, it's that link up here, SharePoint 2010, service accounts, creating those same accounts. So another thing, since we're talking about me looking at my blog, you will notice that the steps that I'm taking are very similar to this, but not exact, for SharePoint 2013. A lot of changes in SharePoint 2013, but not a lot of them around installation. So we're able to leverage a bunch of that. So let's dig in and do that. So there's a service accounts node. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I've got my service accounts created. I've got that done. The next thing I'm going to do is create some managed accounts, and that's kind of the backbone of getting SharePoint working. I also recycle that management shell window. I like to get a fresh window when I'm creating the farm. So somebody mentioned that there's not a MOS 2007 build numbers on there. I never had a MOS 2007 build numbers list. I always wished that I did and never did, so I've got a 2010 one. Okay, so the next thing that I do is create my service accounts. Now you can do this in Central Admin under Security. So unfortunately, I was going to paste all this into the window, and then VMware decided not to cooperate, and I noticed that about 2 minutes before I went on the air. Yeah, I can't copy and paste from the host to the guest. Oh, I guess I can do this. Just a second. Hold tight, folks. I'm a trained professional. Don't try this at home. Talk amongst yourselves. So I can't copy and paste, but I can move files. So this will just give you an idea what I'm doing. Okay, so this is the T-SQL that I used to create all the stuff in SQL. So this, no, that's not it. There's another file. Oh, I've got it. Never mind. Had my notes in too many places. Don't you all be looking at my password and hacking into my stuff either. That's not cool. Once again, demonstrating how I can run things as a different user. Oh, I bet it was. There we go. Okay, so this is the file that I used to make all those changes in SQL. And again, this will be out on the website if I don't forget. But this one gives those accounts the permissions they need, DB creator, security admin. This sets the max degree of parallelism so that SharePoint doesn't cry about it. That sets my RAM to 10 gig, and that sets my model database to simple. So that was the script that I used. Okay, so this is the way that you can create managed accounts. We really only need a couple of managed accounts, much like SharePoint 2010. They haven't got everything worked into there, though they have more, and I think I need to add like my crawl account or something in here. But this is how you want to do it or how you can do it if you want to do it in PowerShell. So you can do that. And then when we come in here, nothing up my sleeve, we will have some managed accounts in there. And that's what we're going to need to create web apps and things like that. So we've got those. I don't set the password expiration stuff to happen automatically. That just it scares the bejesus out of me, honestly. I go in here, I create a couple of content web apps just because I need those for things to work. And we'll walk through that pretty quick because a lot of that hasn't changed. We do know that with SharePoint 2013, claims is now the default, and so that's something new. We don't have the option to pick classic anymore. That seems to be working okay. So we will create one here, and so again, it's all claims. If you want to do classic, you got to do it through PowerShell. So we'll call this one portal.contoso.com. Those of you that have done an install with me before will recognize that I skipped the host header part. SharePoint 2013 does some crazy stuff with the apps. You know, if you have an app store and all that kind of stuff, there's some redirects that go on. This is one of those things I haven't gotten to the bottom of yet, but if you have host headers everywhere, some of that doesn't work. So I'm kind of figuring all that out. That's one of those things that's going to get more defined with time. Zach in the chat room mentions that Microsoft went casual with the error messages, working on it, all that kind of stuff. They absolutely did. That was they did that on purpose. And the funniest one that I've seen so far is in the Office, in the Word 2013 beta. If you do a spell check, hit F7, it checks all your words, and then it says, no spelling or grammar errors found, you're good to go. It actually tells you you're good to go. That's crazy. So since this is the first web app, I'm going to create the app pool. It's going to run as the web app account. Pointing SQL locally. That's all good. I give that database a name that's so obvious that I can't get drunk enough to forget where to attach that should I ever have to. And I'm going to leave it in the custom improvement program. While this is going, this is because this is going to take a bit too, I'm going to talk about some of the service apps. There's some service app changes, sorry to keep you waiting, that I want to talk about because we do have a couple of new service apps to worry about. So once again, you know, as long as we don't run that wizard, which we don't have the option for, we don't want to run that farm configuration wizard. So we want to configure all this manually. And here's a list of these service apps that we can configure. It's not important that you do these in PowerShell as opposed to Central Admin if you have the option. There are some that you have to do in PowerShell, and we'll talk about those. But don't get down on yourself if you do them in Central Admin. The ones that you can, there's no problem. It's just as long as you don't run that wizard. That wizard will create databases with GUIDs in the names. That wizard will also make it very easy for you to talk yourself into installing more services than you really need. And it creates some web apps that I don't agree with, that kind of stuff. So you're better doing this all manually, again, either in Central Admin or PowerShell. So you'll notice we have a couple of different services. We have Access Services and Access 2010. So there's the one for backward compatibility. There's the new one. Got some old friends, BDC, Excel services. New one, machine translation service. That's one that you can have SharePoint 2013 automatically translate content for you. It goes out to the web, does that. Again, with any of these, don't create them unless you're going to use them. If you do want to check it out, by all means, turn it on, install it, but then shut it off if you don't need it. You're going to find out pretty quickly the SharePoint 2013 likes to soak up RAM. Performance point search, all that kind of stuff. So the new ones, the new one, app management, that's another one that you're going to have to install to handle these apps. And we'll talk about how to do that one in a minute. But that's so the app management one, the access services one. Still working on it. Actually, let me check my notes. We might switch back to some slides. I know y'all like slides. Who doesn't like slides, right? Everybody likes slides. Let's do this. So let's look. I don't know if I've got that PowerShell here for creating. For those of you who wanted to see how I did the speech thing, that's how I did that. I'll put that on the thing. There's nothing magic about that either, but it's kind of fun. My user script, download the prerequisites is good. Okay, so this is some stuff that I'll put out there, and I don't know if we're going to have time for it today or not, but this is how I create a bunch of my application pools. And again, I don't necessarily script this to automate it, but just to kind of keep it consistent. I create an app pool called default service app pool, and I can just actually throw that one in right now. Except apparently create app pool. Don't throw your notes into PowerShell. PowerShell doesn't like that. And so when I'm scripting it, I go this route. I create one. I call it that. I like that because if I call it default, then it shows up first in the list, but uses that managed account that I created. But then it also assigns this variable, and everywhere else when I create service apps, like app management, I can use that same thing if I don't define it. So this app management one is a good one. Let's okay, so that one's finished. Let's look at that app management thing for a minute. The app management service application is the one that lets you handle all these new apps that show up in 2013. Everything's an app. Webs are apps, lists are apps, Excel databases are apps. I think I might be an app. It's all apps. So Miriam van Olst, who is a SharePoint MCM from the Netherlands, really smart, has a great blog post on how to get all that configured. And if you haven't read it already, you owe it to yourself to go out there and check that out. She does it all in the UI, though. And this is one of those cases where I saw a task, creating an app service account, and thought, how would I do that in PowerShell? And so this is basically how I learned my PowerShell, is taking up these tasks and figuring out how to do them. So this blog post walks through that whole process of figuring it out. You have to create the app management service app. Then you have to create a subscription services service application. That showed up first in SharePoint 2010 with the tenant stuff, but you've got all that. You got to create those, and then there's a couple of crazy settings you have to make. Miriam's blog post describes it better, but these are some DNS changes you have to make, and then you have to tell SharePoint where to do that. I didn't like how this showed up in the interface. Part of it showed up here, part of it showed another place, so I did it in PowerShell. So let's go ahead. We can do all that right here. Everything's commented out that needs to be. So let's throw that in there too. So again, we've got our database names and all that kind of stuff. That's getting done in there. The next thing that I do is I got to start with service instances. So I've got I've got all these service apps that I'm going to create, and I can create them with PowerShell, I can create them with Central Admin, it doesn't matter, but I need to create the service instance. And I need to start the service instance so that, I don't have, I need to check that. I didn't have that created in DNS first. But before any of this stuff can actually do anything, I have to set it. I have to start the service instance. If you were to do it by hand, that would be in here. They're also called services on server. Got a couple of different names. but it's easy. I use the same ones most every time, so I can just go in here and it will start them all. I don't know that it really matters if you start the service instance first or create the service first. I don't know that that really matters. But that is this managed services on server. And so you can see these are starting. These are the ones that I just kicked off in there. This is all done with timer jobs, so it doesn't happen instantaneously. Now they're all started. So again, you can do it here. You can do it in PowerShell. It doesn't matter. Just so that you know what you're doing and install the ones that you need. Search is another one. Search suffers from the same thing in 2013 as it did in 2010, in that if you create it in here, it creates a bunch of GUIDs in its databases. So I have this script right here, and this is taken mostly from Spence Harbar, another SharePoint MCM, and MCA for that matter. And this creates search, but more importantly lets us define that search database there. So let's go out and do that, and we'll talk a little bit about search. Except, okay, so let's go to the right directory. And, okay, so we're going to let that run. In SharePoint 2013, search takes on a much bigger role. And I'm going to let that run off to the side here because that's going to take a few minutes. And because of that elevated role that search takes, it also requires more stuff, more RAM and all that kind of stuff. When you get search configured and you get your farm running, you're going to notice a whole bunch, 5 of them, of really hungry processes called noderunner.exe. If search gets built up here pretty quickly, we'll go in and look at it. But search has several roles that it does now, and each one of those roles gets done as a node runner process. Those node runner processes will gobble up gigs and gigs of RAM. In most of my test environments where I'm the only person ever hitting it and nothing's going on, those node runner processes will very easily gobble up 2.5 to 3 gig of RAM without even trying. So this is one of those things where I was talking about, you want to make sure you give everything, give SharePoint some memory and all that. These node runner processes are part of that. You can mitigate some of that pain by not having crawls scheduled, things like that. But search on its own is just going to start doing things and keeping itself busy, and it's going to cost you a lot of RAM when that happens. So beware of those processes. And if you see those node runners, that's what those are. That search install script is another good one. I recently had a blog post on how to tell which version of SharePoint is installed. So if you do a lot of scripting, then you might have a script for SharePoint 2010 that created search, and now you've got one for 2013. You could have separate scripts, or at the beginning of your script, you could check to see which version of SharePoint's installed and then run the applicable code. Tariq asks in the chat room, how to turn off search completely. You can just not install search. You can just not run the script that I ran, but there's just a bunch of things that require search. So the social stuff depends on search. Web analytics is now part of search. So you can not install search, but you're going to be missing out on a lot of things, unfortunately. Darcy asks, how does this compare to 2010 and with FAST? So search for the most part got rewritten from the ground up, and a lot of the FAST things got pulled into it. So stuff like document previews and the deep refiners and all that kind of stuff are built in to SharePoint 2013 search. So it's pretty good stuff. And I noticed at the top of the hour, I'm going to go a little long if you guys don't mind. Take another 5-10 minutes worth of your time if you don't mind. Here is some of the links for some stuff that we've talked about. That's a SharePoint 2010 installation guide. The managed metadata service is mostly unchanged from SharePoint 2010, but it does facilitate a new feature that is called metadata-driven navigation. And it's a pretty deep concept to get into, but you can do some weird things with URLs and all that. But if you create your managed metadata service app by yourself, either through Central Admin or PowerShell, it doesn't check a box that says use this service app for navigation. And so if you've got buddies who ran that wizard and you're making fun of them and you're giving them wedgies and stuff in the hall, and then they're like, oh yeah, well my metadata-driven search or my metadata-driven navigation works and yours doesn't, well, you don't want to have that. So that blog post talks about how to do that, and you can do that in Central Admin or PowerShell. Set up the app domain. We looked at that one. Create web apps. If you want to create your web apps in PowerShell, you want to do them with claims, but it's not real intuitive how to do that, so this blog post handles that. So we got a couple of questions in the chat room. Usman asks, do we have to run all these scripts, or can we do it in Central Admin? It depends. Some you can do in Central Admin, some you can't, Usman. For instance, you can't create a new subscription service in Central Admin. You still can't create a usage service app in Central Admin. You can create a search service app in Central Admin, but it's going to have database GUIDs. So some of it you can, some of it you can't. The good news is all of my poorly written, disjointed PowerShell that I've used will be out on that link for you, and so you can go through it. And then if you look at some of it and can't make heads or tails of it, you can just do it in Central Admin. I won't think any less of you, Usman. You seem like a nice guy, so however you do it will be fine. Jonathan asks, will I be conducting a webinar on the user profile service in SharePoint 2013? I'm guessing at some point I will, Jonathan. You know how I am. I'm a glutton for punishment. I don't know any better, so I'll probably do that. I will tell you that there aren't huge differences in the user profile service from 2010 to 2013. The silver lining of the that cloud, the glasses half full part of that, is all of the crazy hoops that you had to jump through, all the hard-fought battles you fought in SharePoint 2010 to get the user profile service working. The good news is that wasn't all for waste, because you could do all those same techniques in 2013. The one big change is that after you get the service app created and you've somehow convinced the sync service to start working, we have an additional import option. So in SharePoint 2007, an Active Directory import was pretty simple, and in 2010 that got a little tough, a little ugly, and so in 2013 they have added the old version back. So you can do an AD import with the 2007 way, which is read-only, stuff like that, or you can do the 2010 way, which lets you do things like copy your pictures back and things like that. But to answer your question, Jonathan, I'm sure I'll be doing more of these things. So speaking of, we got a whole bunch of these going on this week, so you got 3 more days this week to watch these webinars. I hear that guy Shane is doing an upgrade one tomorrow or Thursday or whatever. I'm sure it'll be horrible, but he'll cry if people don't show up. So if you're going to be upgrading SharePoint 2010, at least sign up for it. So let's go back to the VM here quick. I know you folks are antsy to get on with the parts of your day that won't be stinking like this one. So now search is done. My script ran to completion, to success. And if we look over here, we should be seeing some node runner processes kicking in here. There they are. Look at them. We haven't done a damn thing yet. We haven't crawled anything. We haven't even created any content. Those little devils, those little rascals are already taking a gig of RAM, more than a gig of RAM. They're not even doing anything yet. So gotta be aware of those node runners and be close to these notepads. Now in here, we're going to have search. Another great thing about search, and I have this on my blog, there's now native support for PDF files. So you don't need to worry about installing a PDF filter or PDF icons or any of that kind of stuff. It's all in there. So in our last couple of minutes, let me go through my notes, see what other stuff I've got. Do you have any questions? Oh, we got a couple more. How do I keep the SharePoint 2013 environment clean and healthy? Do I recommend any specific procedures or important advices? You know, that's, Tariq, right now, that I haven't done all that yet. I don't know. Most of these environments that I have created have been VMs and all that. They haven't stuck around very long. So I don't really have a lot of advice on that right now. Joan, Eagle Eye, noticed there that the usage application was created. It looks like Search did create it, though let me check to make sure I didn't just put that in my script. But we have that same problem where the proxy wasn't started. So there's PowerShell that you can use to do that. Let me see if I can remember this off the top of my head. Probably not, and I'll become very embarrassed, and you're all going to laugh at me. And so E10. That's yep. So you do have to start the proxy. I don't remember. I don't have that. I could look at the PowerShell up. I don't have the top of my head. But it does look like it created it automatically. So yeah, you're right. Okay, so Art's got the long question. I'll save that one for the end. He posted that one earlier. He's been very patient. So I'm going to cut this short. I knew we weren't going to get all this in an hour. Are there any other specific questions before we take off about this? I might have to schedule a part 2, I guess. And again, this is it's beta software, so we're going to have some. There's going to be some more of these. I'm going to be learning some more of these lessons. I'll give another minute for questions here. So Tariq asks, I noticed that some services get stopped in Control Panel Windows services. Yeah, so if you notice any SharePoint services, and I went about that the wrong way, if you notice any SharePoint services in Windows that that are not started, come here you, don't start them in here. So if you look, and I should be pretty clean right now, but let's say you're in here and this app fabric, this distributed cache stuff, this thing is set to automatic, but it's not started in here. Don't start it in here. That will fix the symptom, but it won't fix the problem. Something on SharePoint's not happy, so you're going to want to fix that and let that start it for you. Same with the FIM services. Once these get set up, they set to automatic. It's tempting to go in and fix those, but you don't want to do that. Russell asks, is SQL 2008 still okay? I believe SQL 2008 and SQL 2008 R2 are still supported. You'll need 2012 for some of the fancy BI things. And I don't have a list of those right now. There's a paper out there. I probably have a link somewhere. If I think about it, I'll throw it in here. Art says, I got a bunch of stuff there. Yep, I want to do. So he says he's got an issue with not being able to find a configuration database. That's usually a SQL thing. I've found in test environments, and this is something that I do to myself all the time, I call all my test environments Contoso. And that's so that it's consistent with Microsoft stuff. And if I ever, write a white paper for them or something, all of my domain names are good. But what I've found is that on my network, because I can run VMs on my laptop or my desktop or Hyper-V or whatever, if I've got another Contoso lurking out there somewhere, when my, like this one I made Contoso, the AD comes up, it does a blast out there, and it sees another Contoso, and it takes them a minute to figure out what's going on. And in that minute that happens, SQL can't log in, and all kinds of stuff fails. So if you've got, in test environments, if you've got SQL that stops working or whatever, check to see if you've got 2 domains out there that have the same name. Art, if you want to send me an email with your full question, though, that's probably a better platform for that. Zach asked, is managed metadata navigation cross-site collection navigation, or is just something simple about the URLs? Zach, I thought it was going to be cross-site collection, but if you try to use the same term set for 2 site collections, you get a nasty gram that says, hey, you're trying to use the same term set across 2 site collections. So clearly, they expect you to not be able to do that. So I need to look into that more to figure out how that works. So, well, I've gone 10 minutes over. I apologize, folks. I apologize we didn't get the whole farm created. But if you've got any questions, again, todd.klindt@rackspace.com or out on Twitter @ToddKlindt. Definitely, if there's any kind of evaluation stuff, fill that out. Let them know that you like this kind of stuff, because I'd like to do more of it. And if my bosses think that it's valuable, then they're going to keep letting me do it. Also, some of you, I recognize some of your names, on Monday nights at 8:30 Central, I do a live SharePoint netcast. So it's this kind of thing where I talk about stuff that I've done and problems that I've found. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see when that happens, but you can watch me live on Stickcam, and I talk about all this kind of stuff. That's Monday at 8:30. Central Time, and then that's recorded. You can see them on my blog. So I know there's some folks in here, Mike and those guys, that show up to that sometimes. So jump in there. We can chat more. So thank you very much for your time, and I can't wait to hear some stories about you guys filling out or creating your own test environments.